Let me also introduce now our second responder, Stephanie Bertrand. She's an independent curator, a Thessaloniki-based curator coming from Montreal. She's completing a PhD in museology, and she examines issues of transparency, inclusion, and mediation in curating. She will talk about antinomies of socially engaged art. Welcome.
Thank you. In the previous statements, there were a lot of different examples of socially engaged projects, both from artistic and institutional perspectives. Rather than re-examine these examples, as a responder, I thought it would be more useful to begin to unpack the discourse around these works, to think through some of their effects. To do so, I want to focus on a series of oppositions that shape socially engaged art. Back there. These dichotomies include actuality versus the symbolic, instrumentality versus autonomy, didacticism versus opacity, and determinacy versus ambiguity. Conventionally speaking, actuality, instrumentality, didacticism, and determinacy are all terms associated with activism, whereas the symbolic, autonomy, opacity, and ambiguity fall within the realm of art. As socially engaged art is a form of art activism, it combines terms from both sides of the divide, which may be viewed as signposts for how varying conceptions and practices are structured. Typically, when these terms surface, it's usually within a debate on whether social practices do or should constitute art, in other words, on the distinction, or lack thereof, between social work and socially engaged art, and you heard Gera discuss this in his statement. But beyond the specific debate, it's interesting to note how different alliances between these terms not only shape different understandings of praxis, but also define varying politics for socially engaged art, suggesting different scales or criteria for evaluating its operational effects. For within the discourse on art for social change, these terms are not fixed. They are in fact fluid and realigned in different distributions that impact standing, format, reception, and so forth. To be clear, when I talk about assessing the effects of socially engaged art, I don't mean evaluating the ethics of individual projects, nor am I interested in examining the related dichotomy of consensus versus dissensus. Rather, I want to examine how terms that are associated with artifice, autonomy, and equivocality, along with their opposites, are aligned in different ways, thus articulating alternate understandings and outcomes. Certainly, all conceptions of socially engaged art involve an interplay between all of these opposing terms. However, they are always ordered within a certain hierarchy that rearticulates the politics of socially engaged art. Today, I want to focus more specifically on the writings of Nato Thompson and Pablo Gera, both because we heard them speak, but also because they've published some of the most defining books on the subject. Briefly, as you will see, my reading suggests that Gera primarily, while he makes a strong case for the symbolic to justify designating social practices as art, he categorically emphasizes the preeminence of actuality in his book. Now, his position vis-à-vis instrumentality is less straightforward. In fact, Gera writes that a work of socially engaged art, quote, does not control a social situation in an instrumental and a strategic way in order to achieve a specific end, end quote. If I nonetheless position his understanding on the side of instrumentality as opposed to autonomy, it is because Gera subsequently insists on numerous occasions throughout his book that socially engaged art is a goal-oriented practice. The most explicit example is when he states, quote, for better or worse, an artist must adhere to certain structures to attain certain results, end quote. That being said, Gera isn't actually contradicting himself. By disavowing instrumentality, he's in fact rejecting one-sided, manipulative, propagandist approaches, including practices that benefit the artist's personal advancement at the expense of the community. To do this, he cites Jürgen Habermas's notion of communicative action to qualify the process at work in socially engaged art. Very succinctly, Communicative action is a non-coercive social action based on mutual cooperation and argumentation that assumes the symmetrical equality of all parties involved and aims towards emancipation. Thus, when it comes to socially engaged art, both the artist and the community of participants must share a mutual interest. However, this interest, I would argue, implies both mutual curiosity and mutual use towards achieving certain ends. As Gera points out, if one actor becomes the exclusive service agent of the other, then the enterprise of socially engaged art fails, thus belying mutual avail. Hence, instrumentality in his conception is understood much more in the positive connotation of the term as symmetrical agency. Finally, according to my reading, Gera's view also hinges upon ambiguity. He states, quote, socially engaged art functions by attaching itself to subjects and problems that normally belong to other disciplines, moving them temporarily into a space of ambiguity, end quote. In my understanding, ambiguity plays two roles here. On the one hand, according to the statement, it refers to a certain semantic indeterminacy associated with the realm of art that by, quote, temporarily snatching away subjects, brings new insights to a particular problem or condition and in turn makes it visible to other disciplines, end quote. In other words, designating something as art highlights it and opens it up to a range of other meanings and values. On the other hand, this kind of open-endedness is also an integral part of socially engaged art's processual approach. Thus, ambiguity also refers to a degree of indeterminacy or openness when it comes to format and content. Gera writes, quote, we need to create frameworks that are not completely predetermined in theme or structure, as an overly predetermined plan will likely not allow for the input of potential collaborators, end quote. Moving on to Nato Thompson, as I stated earlier, my reading suggests that his conception of socially engaged art primarily revolves around actuality, autonomy, and ambiguity or opacity. Now, I separate these two terms, but Thompson uses them interchangeably. Thompson's emphasis on actuality is really twofold. On the one hand, he advocates for a politics of doing, which, as opposed to political theory and critique, frames lived encounters and somatic experiences as means to enact concrete transformations. On the other hand, his adherence to actuality extends beyond individual projects to encompass what he calls an infrastructure of resonance. For Thompson, this notion refers to a web of interconnected tangible structures that determine our conception of all phenomena from artworks to our sense of self. Thompson defines the infrastructure of resonance as a set of material conditions that produce a form of meaning. In his words, quote, an infrastructure of resonance isn't a vague series of vectors for information to travel through. It's a series of places, people, and objects locatable in the world, end quote. So it's not an abstract network. It exists in space and can be tracked to buildings and bodies. And this is something that you heard him refer to towards the end of his statement when he highlighted the politics associated with money and the necessity of investing arts funding into radical movements and infrastructure. Now, Thompson's notion of a tangible infrastructure of resonance is crucial to then understanding his inclination towards ambiguity or opacity. Earlier, you also heard him mention the mitigated response to Jeremy Deller's work, where activists saw it as lacking in political efficacy and art world critics as lacking in artistic quality. In his book, Seeing Power, Art and Activism in the 21st Century, this work and its paradoxical reception are the starting point for a chapter that explores the conflicting views and political ramifications associated with didacticism versus ambiguity, and their respective ties to the domains of activism and art. For the purposes of this talk, the most salient point is the recent realization by the art community that ambiguity is both more commercial and more susceptible to hegemonic co-option. This has driven a number of critical artists towards didacticism as a way to affirm a clear infrastructural allegiance to avoid seeing their work function as a placeholder for power. And yet, in spite of this observation and his avowed sympathies for the activist community, Thompson ultimately argues in favor of ambiguity, which he endows with the potential to affect becoming. Based on the thinking of Deleuze and Guattari, Thompson sees ambiguity as a provision that ensures the openness required to create spaces that liberate subjects, of course contingent upon a certain infrastructure of resonance. So, these sites of becoming are collective ventures where political agency takes the form of self-production. In Thompson's words, quote, ambiguous aesthetic actions can often act as facilitators for radically different conditions of being. Because ambiguous aesthetics can be open-ended, they can allow for forms of participation that evoke curiosity and a collective sense of becoming, end quote. And here is where I would say autonomy enters the equation. Ambiguity qua openness, combined with actuality qua lived action and concrete infrastructure, both intersect with autonomy to produce sites of alternative subjectivities, and those are Thompson's words. Thus, in his conception, autonomy translates as independence from hegemonic power, i.e. sites that function outside of the logic of capital. And he discusses this against the backdrop of the increased privatization of civic spaces and public institutions by large corporations that deploy sophisticated branding strategies under the guise of charity, community engagement, and education. Against this growing capitalist takeover, Thompson credits sites of becoming with the creation of a new kind of political agency enacted by free subjects through active participation, sustained engagement, and transversality put into practice via non-hierarchical modes of organization. So with this incredibly brief overview of Helgera and Thompson's thoughts, what I wanted to highlight is how the initial antinomies might be used not only to debate the artistic merit of social practices, but also serve as indexes to gain a better understanding of the discourses around these practices, the field that they shape, and the stakes involved in their claims. If you take, for instance, the idea of emancipation, often cited in relation to socially engaged art, it can have very different effects. So, French sociologists Boltanski and Capello distinguish between two types of alienation, a specific and a generic alienation. The specific alienation basically refers to the exploitation of a group, whereas the generic alienation refers to any kind of imposition or necessity that restricts individual freedom, be it filial ties, social conventions, or citizenship obligations. Whereas emancipation from a specific alienation involves overcoming an abusive practice or condition, emancipation from a generic alienation entails a gain in autonomy and self-fulfillment, freedom of choice, and multiplicity of identities. So, if we return to Helgera and Thompson, for Helgera, through communicative action, socially engaged art creates an emancipated community, which he defines using Rancière's terms as a community of narrators and translators. In other words, a group of empowered individuals who acquire critical and experiential insights towards shaping their own narratives. Meanwhile, as described earlier, Thompson promotes spaces of becoming that liberate and foster alternative subjectivities. Thus, while Helgera and Thompson are both absolutely for social justice, it is striking that their particular configurations of actuality and ambiguity produce a discourse that answers much more to a generic alienation than a specific one. In conclusion, as initially stated, while there is always an interplay at work in every conception of socially engaged art between all of the terms of these antinomies, they are systematically ordered in varying semantic and deontological hierarchies that formulate different politics. So, a closer examination of how these alignments structure both discourse and practice can provide, in my view, a valuable tool in assessing socially engaged art. Thank you.
Definitely.